All right, this is 20 part B. This is going to be a pretty short little lecture. Because a lot of the stuff is going to be covered throughout the year, so I don't want you to like dwell too much on it. The big picture things for chapters 1 and 20 are kind of what you want to focus on. But things like this right here, U.S. agencies, you need to basically know the difference between things that are international, that are going to look out for human rights, and you're going to look at things that are specific to the U.S. So just make sure you know, we did take a quiz where some people were saying the EPA is something that would investigate an outbreak of like malaria in Africa, but it's not. This is the U.S. Okay, these are U.S. agencies. OSHA is Health Occupational Safety Standards stuff. Department of Energy. It's not just things that have to do with how we power our houses, but these things are also in charge of looking at the safety of things like nuclear power plants. So you might want to know that, right? The Department of Energy is responsible for maintaining and regulating, checking up on nuclear power plants and other safety of like our energy facilities, right? Because those things are very important to keep safe, and keeping safe doesn't mean we're keeping it safe from people necessarily and terroristic type of attacks, but we're also talking about just making sure stuff is up to regulations and standards, right? We're updating our technology as we go. All right. Several approaches to measuring and sustaining sustainability, achieving sustainability. So this is something that you've been kind of looking at with your own country already, Human Development Index. Hopefully you're getting close to the end of your research and adding this to your note card. I'm really interested to see what you guys come up with when we look at sustainability for your specific country and comparing it to your group's countries. And also the this Human Development Index looks at, you need to know this, what goes into how we judge how well a country's doing. Okay, so there are different ways to do that, but you need to know that these are things we're going to compare countries for the entire year. Life expectancy. So if you live really long time, it probably correlates to different health services and government services that are there, some infrastructure that's there, right? Knowledge and education. Okay, knowledge of things that keep you safe, and education to kind of make good decisions and make better life choices, including careers. Okay, Human Poverty Index is another way of kind of measuring and achieving sustainability. We compare countries and kind of see how they're doing. It was developed by the United Nations to investigate the proportion of a population suffering from deprivation in a country with a high HDI. Okay. The policy process in the United States, go ahead and take a look at this. So you kind of want to know that this is the way that we kind of do things in assessing problems. So think about your lab that you did today with the goldfish. Think about how that would relate to maybe ways that we would come up with solutions as a country, right? So hopefully you realize that we were simulating large scale communities, right? We're simulating what happens with a resource that's shared between multiple groups of people, right? So when there's an issue that comes about because of some public property or something that we all share collectively, we have to come up with an idea. So that way we can fix that problem and it's not a problem in the future, right? How we do now is not always the only important thing. Surviving today isn't what's important. Sustainability has a lot more to do with what happens in the future. So we have to develop things like policies, and we try to see if it helps fix the problem. If it doesn't, we make it better. We don't just get rid of regulations because they aren't perfect, right? All right, so here are some ways to encourage sustainability. Command and control approach. So there's some governments around the world. Maybe your government that you're studying has more of a command and control approach, right? You want to kind of see how your country makes the decisions that deal with long-term sustainability. Okay, you have an incentive-based approach, strategy for pollution control that constructs financial and other incentives for lowering emissions based on profits and benefits. So maybe you'll get a tax break if you're able to cut your carbon emissions by 20% within 10 years, right? So that's what they mean by that. You have something called a green tax, placed on environmentally harmful activities or emissions to internalize some of the externalities. You remember what externalities are, right? They're costs not obviously associated with the production of some product or good or service, right? So they'll just straight up put a green tax on there and say, if you do this, we're not interested in you reducing it and giving you money. It's just if you do it, you're going to get a tax for it, and that's how it is. Okay, and then we look at this thing called the triple bottom line, where you focus on three factors: the economic, environmental, and social. And whenever you make decisions about the business, the economy, and the environment, you try to make sure that all three of those things align. It's kind of like a win-win-win situation, right? Here's another kind of good example of that. So when we talk about the triple bottom line, you just remember in environmental science, when you're answering a question of any kind, you don't want anything that's leaning 100% in any direction. You don't want to toss humans overboard so that the environment can be saved. You don't want to toss over our abilities to sustain ourselves and allocate scarce resources to save the environment. And you don't want to just make sure human development is key without any regard for the environment or maybe our economic system, right? Because if we lose any of these things here, if we have a loss of any of these two things, what ends up happening is the third thing will end up declining as well, right? So just think about it like this. How interested in human rights can you be if you have not enough money to feed your country, or if the environment is so degraded that you can't find anywhere safe to live, right? There isn't safe water, the air is dirty. You can't possibly be as interested in these things, right? If the other two suffer, and the same goes if you were to turn this in any direction, right? You'd end up with problems, right? Go ahead and take a look at these policies for promoting sustainability. I'm not going to go over them too much, but we will cover them throughout the year, and you'll be very familiar with them. So if you don't know them right now, that's all right. We'll probably do some activity in class where we categorize them so you kind of get a little familiar with them. What I would recommend as we go throughout the year is just take note of these and maybe just have like a little Quizlet app or maybe just some note cards over all the legislation that we find and quiz over it from time to time. It's not super important that you memorize it and know it cold, because I'd be shocked if you get more than 2 or 3 of these questions on a 100-question test, right? So if you miss all 3 of these, you're still, batting 97%, and that's pretty much a 5 as long as you put your name on the FRQs. So again, go over these every once in a while just so you don't forget them, but you're going to be very, very familiar with things like RCRA, CERCLA, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. Like, these are things, Clean Air Act, these are things we're all going to go over when we get to resource waste management, when we get to land management later on in the year. So really don't stress over this right now, okay? Like, I'm really not going to, I might ask one question here or there as we're doing the quizzes over these, and I'll ask them much more as we get closer to those chapters that have to do with pollution, all right? 2 major challenges of our time are reducing poverty and stewarding the environment. We already talked about this word of stewarding, right? It's when we're taking care of it for the meantime. We are not the owners, but right now we have the responsibility, right? Because this is the kingdom we reside over, Earth, right? Okay. Millennium Development Goals. Okay, you need to know this is looking to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education. This helps everybody, whether you're poor or rich, whether you're in a developing nation or a developed nation, to have the highest levels of education. It brings everything up, okay? You're able to make better decisions about the world around you. You're able to make better decisions about the way you decide to bring up and raise a family, the decisions on how you use the environment. So environmentalism goes hand in hand with educating your population, right? A very highly educated population is able to make better informed decisions about long-term sustainability. Had you known what the outcome of the lab was today, when we did the goldfish lab, had you been educated on what the outcome would probably be, or what sort of tools that I had given you, actually, I had given you enough tools to kind of be sustainable if you had thought about it, right? But y'all acted on some very short-sighted assumptions, which were by design. I wanted that to happen. I wanted it to be a complete disaster. But hopefully, throughout all the chaos, your historians came up with some ideas that they saw. Maybe they saw some patterns. Maybe they saw some things that repeated over and over. Maybe your business analysts maybe worked out how long it would take to become sustainable, and also be profitable, right? And get 100 on the lab. So those are things that I'm talking about. Education. Yeah, they help everyone, and then it ends up in turn helping the environment. Gender equality and empowering women. We will do a few days this year dedicated to looking at exactly how gender equality and educated women lead to a more sustainable future for us, right? It doesn't sound like it's obviously causal, right? But it is. It really is, and we'll get into that. Reduce child mortality. If you're not spending so much time accompanying dying children in the hospital, you're able to work. Okay, that's really what it is. You're not spending money on healthcare for something that's not going to better the health of your country, but it's just kind of palliative care for people that are dying. So if you can reduce child mortality, you can increase production of the country, and obviously, it's just a better quality of life if your kids aren't dying all the time. Improve maternal health, right? You have healthier mothers; they can raise healthier babies that have less health problems, and they're able to go back to work sooner. They're able to go back and get an education sooner, right? So these things are important. Combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. These are things that have actually declined in terms of how much aid the U.S. is giving in recent years. But it's very, very important that we help fight these things all over the place where the infrastructure isn't as good. You don't know anybody probably in the U.S. that's ever had malaria, but it is a problem in other places, right? Because they do not have the same infrastructure and public services that we do in the United States, right? Hopefully, if you're a country in Malaysia, if you got a country in Malaysia that's maybe in mid-developing, I want you to kind of, as we go throughout the year, especially as we get towards communicable diseases at the end of the year, I want you to see how your country deals with malaria and mosquito-borne illnesses. Ensure environmental sustainability. Okay, so this is important for reasons that we will discuss all year. And develop a global partnership for development. And so I want you to kind of think about technology with this. So I want you to think about technology. I want you to think about pollution. Yeah, technology and pollution. So we come up with world multi-nation agreements on how to become more sustainable by sharing technology and coming up with some quotas for how we deal with pollution. Environmental justice. The inequitable distribution of pollution and environmental degradation with their adverse effects on humans and ecosystems. So what that means is if we mess up the air, if we mess up the water, we might have ways of filtering that stuff out for our local biome, right, or our local ecosystem environment that we live in. But as we're about to find out in the next couple chapters when we look at Earth cycles, right? Different things that cycle around the biosphere. Water moves, right? It doesn't have borders, and neither does air, right? Air circulates. There are currents that go all over the place. So messing up something here, even if we can clean it, doesn't mean that somewhere like south of the border, Mexico or Canada, isn't going to be affected. So places that might not be as well equipped to deal with that, to deal with our pollution, are really getting the short end of the stick. So it's not fair. So that's injustice, right? And then also people with lower incomes and minorities in particular have disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards. And of course, this isn't always the case, right? It really has a lot more to do with your socioeconomic status. It just so happens that right now in our country, a lot of minorities do fall into the lower socioeconomic status, right? But it just turns out that when you're in that demographic of people with less money, you have a lot less agency over where you live. You don't get to pick where you live. You have to live somewhere that you can afford. And sometimes affordable land is land that's either in the process of reclamation, remediation of some, maybe an oil spill or a gas leak or some sort of chemical spill. And so you don't get to choose to move away from that. They always say you can vote with your dollar, vote with your feet on where you want to go. But, it's hard to pick up and leave if you live somewhere like a very, very destitute, poor part of like Louisiana. It's hard to get up and move. You don't have the means to do that. So the people that have the least money usually get exposed the most to environmental hazards, and we'll see that with fracking this year. We look at fracking a lot. We'll see that with lead in Detroit, right, in Flint, Michigan, and things like that. So anyways, that's kind of an overview of all the types of things that we're going to look at this year. I want you to kind of think, how do the topics of this chapter and the first chapter relate to your life, and how do they relate to some of the things that we've done in class? Always be thinking about the big picture, even though we're studying a wide variety of minutia and all that. All right, good luck.